The morning began with a hush, the kind that belongs to wide and open places where the land itself holds its breath. The plains stretched golden beneath the sky not yet woken by the sun, the kind of sky that promises heat later but still cradles coolness in its arms. On the edge of that emptiness stood a ranch house, wood-weathered, roof sagging in places, leaning against the horizon like an old man who has known too much wind. Inside, the silence was broken only by the creak of timber and the restless shifting of horses outside, their soft whinnies brushing against the dawn. The man who lived there rose not because he wanted to, but because habit dragged him out of bed. His steps were slow, boots pulling against the floor as though the house itself wished to keep him still. He poured water into a basin, washed his face, and stared at the reflection that looked back. Eyes hollow, jawline unshaven, a face carved by sun and sorrow. Once he had been more than this. Once laughter had filled these walls. Once love had lit the rooms. But love had left him, torn out like a page from a book, leaving only the jagged edge behind. Betrayal had sealed itself into his bones, and now he lived as one merely breathing, not alive. When the chores called, he answered without spirit, saddled his horse, rode out across the land that was his inheritance and his prison. The earth lay wide and endless, but his world had grown small, bound within fences and silence. In town, he was no more than a shadow that came and went. The storekeeper nodded. The preacher offered a word. The ranch hands muttered. All spoke with lowered voices of raids, of Apache riders slipping through the night. Fear lingered in the air like smoke. They warned him the way men do when they're more frightened than wise. Stay clear of them, don't meddle. Nothing good comes from crossing paths with that blood. Their words echoed as he rode, not because he believed them, but because he had nothing else to believe. It was on one of those rides, when the land stretched so far the horizon blurred into sky, that he saw her. At first only a shape in the dust, crumpled, unmoving, caught in the weeds at the canyon's edge. His horse shifted uneasily, sensing what he had not yet seen. As he drew closer, the shape became flesh, and the flesh was a woman. Her skin bore the hue of the sunburnt earth, her dark hair tangled across her face, her body broken by wounds that told of struggle. Apache. The word rang sharp in his mind, as sharp as the warnings he had heard in town. She was not a frail thing, even in her ruin. Pride still clung to her posture, even half-conscious. Her eyes, when they fluttered open, burned with defiance, as if she would rather spit in death's face than ask for mercy. He reined his horse, staring down at her, and his first instinct was the one the world had taught him. Leave her. She was forbidden. Trouble. Nothing but a path to ruin. He turned the thought over like a coin in his hand, ready to ride on. But something held him still. Some quiet pull. Some reminder of the man he had been before silence claimed him. He could not make himself passerby. With a grunt, he dismounted. The air smelled of dust and blood. She tried to rise when he bent toward her, a hiss of pain escaping between her teeth, but her body betrayed her. Carefully, almost against his will, he gathered her into his arms. She weighed less than he expected, yet carried the heaviness of a life that had fought too hard. She did not speak. She did not beg. Her gaze locked on his, sharp as flint, and in it was no gratitude, only defiance, only the insistence that she would not break, not even here. He brought her home. Each step of the horse felt like a decision that could not be undone. In the house, he laid her down, set aside the fear that whispered of what men would say if they knew. He filled a bowl with clean water, washed the blood from her skin, stitched the cuts that could be stitched. She bore the pain without a sound, eyes steady, lips pressed thin. When he set bread and broth near her, she accepted it with dignity, though she did not thank him. She did not have to. In the silence between them, something stirred. Not trust, not yet, but something older than words. A man hollowed by grief, a woman too proud to bend, both stranded in a world that called them enemies. And though neither of them would speak it aloud, something had begun to shift in that quiet room, something neither betrayal nor blood could fully forbid. Evening crept slow across the land. shadows stretching long and thin until they draped themselves over the ranch house like a heavy quilt. Inside, the silence had a life of its own. Two figures moved within those wooden walls, a man and a woman, strangers beneath the same roof. And though neither spoke, the quiet between them was louder than words ever could be. It was the silence of mistrust, of wounds still raw, of lives forced together by fate's unrelenting hand. Days passed like this. The rancher tried in small ways to reach her, not with tenderness, for tenderness was something he had long forgotten, but with the rough offerings of a man who did not know what else to give. Food left by her bedside, a blanket folded near her shoulders. She accepted what she must, but only what dignity allowed. She ate enough to keep her strength, drank the water he set down, but her eyes told him she did not mistake necessity for charity. She was a guest, yes, but not a supplicant. Her silence, her defiance, became its own kind of language. A glance at the fire's glow, a pause before lifting a spoon, the faintest nod when her wounds hurt less. They spoke more in these quiet exchanges than in any words. When he rode into town, the world's noise returned. A ranch hand tipped his hat, but let his gaze linger too long, suspicion curling in his mouth. The storekeeper's wife lowered her voice when she asked if he'd heard of the raids nearby. A sheriff leaned against his post, eyes sharp, words sharper still. Trouble. He was told in more ways than one. Trouble to let her stay, trouble to keep her under his roof. Send her back, they muttered. Don't ruin yourself with this. Their prejudice hung in the air like smoke from a fire that never burned out. The rancher carried it home with him, the weight pressing heavier each day. He told himself he could send her away, that it wasn't his burden to bear. Yet when he opened the door and saw her still there, fragile yet unbroken, he found he could not. One morning, a shift came. He stepped outside to mend a broken fence line, the wood splintered from wind and wear. To his surprise, she followed. At first he thought she meant to leave, but she stopped near him, silent, watching. Then, with hands still healing but steady, she began to gather the fallen rails. She moved with practiced skill, her touch firm, her movements sure. He said nothing, only let her work. For the first time, it felt less like tending to a stranger and more like sharing the rhythm of life itself. When their hands brushed against the same piece of timber, neither pulled away at once. The moment was fleeting, a spark hidden beneath the weight of caution, yet it lingered like a ghost in the air long after they parted. That night the sky broke open. A storm rolled in fierce and sudden, lightning splitting the dark with jagged white scars. Rain battered the windows, thunder rattled the old walls. She sat near the fire, back rigid, eyes darting with every strike of light. Fear lived in her still, though she would never admit it. The storm made her small, vulnerable in a way she could not mask. Slowly, almost against her will, she drew nearer to him, not seeking warmth of body, but safety of presence. He did not reach for her, did not break the fragile thread of trust she offered. He only kept the fire alive, feeding it with logs until its glow outshone the storm's wild light. She leaned back against the wall, her breathing slowing, eyelids heavy. Sleep took her in fits, the thunder still loud, but the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of his quiet watch eased her rest. He sat awake long into the night, the shadows dancing across her face. For the first time since she had entered his home, the silence between them felt less like a wall, and more like a bridge waiting to be crossed. The storm raged on outside, but inside, something gentler stirred. Not passion, not yet, but the first tender root of trust sinking into soil long left barren. Morning came with a softness the land rarely granted. Light spilled golden across the ranch, washing over fences, barns, and the tired house until even the weathered would seem to breathe again. She stepped outside into that glow, her hair loose, her face softened by a rare peace, and for the first time since he had carried her across his threshold, she did not seem like a stranger. The land itself appeared to welcome her, as though it had been waiting all along for her presence. He watched from the doorway, saying nothing, letting the sight of her fill some hollow space inside him that had been empty far too long. Their days began to find rhythm. He showed her the tasks of the ranch, not with command but with patience. how to measure grain for the horses, how to mend the leather straps that held the saddle, how to stack hay so it would last through the harsher winds. She listened in silence, learning quickly, hands steady. In turn, she began to share small fragments of her own ways. Herbs gathered from the earth, ground into powders that eased pain better than anything in his tin box of medicine. Knots tied swift and true, binding leather strong enough to outlast storms. She taught without words, demonstrating, letting him see. He accepted, not as one humoring a guest, but as a man willing to learn. Their silence no longer pressed heavy between them. It stretched and bent into harmony, like two notes finally finding the same key. It was during one of these quiet labors that his voice broke the stillness, not with instruction but confession. As they worked side by side, tying up a broken gate, he spoke of the woman who had once been his. A life he had thought was certain, a love he had believed would carry him through his years. She had left, gone with another man, and in her leaving had taken more than herself. She had taken his belief in tenderness, his willingness to open his heart again. Since then he had closed himself, shut his doors, spoken only to horses and wood, living not as a man alive, but as a man waiting out the years. She paused in her work, her eyes fixed on the wood she held, and for a moment he thought she would not answer. But then she spoke, her words low, carrying the weight of battle survived. She told him fragments, never the whole, yet enough. Of being taken, of being cast aside, of surviving when survival had seemed impossible. She did not shape her story into pity, nor did she soften it into comfort. She spoke as one who had endured. He listened, not with judgment, not with pity, but with the quiet recognition of another soul who had lost something they could never get back. In that moment, they did not see each other as enemies, nor strangers, nor the categories the world would force upon them. They saw each other as survivors. It was then he began to notice her differently. Not just as the wounded woman he had carried home, not as the burden he had chosen against all warnings, but as something else. He found himself watching her when she worked, the curve of her hands shaping bread, the soft sound she made when she hummed to herself without realizing it. Her presence steadied him, warmed the cold rooms of the house, filled the spaces where silence used to echo too loudly. And she, though still cautious, felt the same. She had known cruelty in men, but not this kind of steadiness. Not this safety that asked for nothing but gave so much in return. The air between them began to change. Each glance lingered longer. Each pause carried weight. Desire, unspoken but heavy, began to gather like storm clouds. Yet it remained restrained, forbidden by the world outside and by their own fear of what it might mean. They carried it in silence, each aware of it, each careful not to let it break into words that could not be unsaid. One evening, the sky blushed with the dying light of the sun, and the ranch was painted in twilight. They stood near the corral, horses shifting gently in the fading day. The air was cool, the world holding its breath in the last moments before night. He turned toward her, something in his chest aching to break free. Slowly, his hand lifted, reaching, almost brushing, against her face. But at the last moment he stopped, his fingers hovering close but not touching, as though some invisible barrier held him back. Her eyes met his, shimmering with a mixture of invitation and fear. She did not step away. She did not step closer. She simply looked at him, and in that gaze lay everything neither of them dared to speak. The truth of what was stirring between them, undeniable yet unsaid. The moment passed, the silence folding around them once more, but the air remained charged, alive with all that had been left unspoken. They turned back to the horses, to the fading light, to the safety of work and habit. Yet both knew something had changed. The ground beneath them had shifted, carrying them closer to a place neither of them had ever meant to go. Dawn rose heavy with silence, the kind that feels too full, as though the earth itself held its breath. Fog clung low across the plains, rolling thick and pale, and beneath it came the thunder of hooves. The sound grew nearer, steady, relentless, carrying with it the voices of men hardened by prejudice and stirred by envy. Torches burned against the dim light, rifles glinting with the first break of sun. They were coming, not with reason, but with rage. He heard them before he saw them, standing in the doorway of his ranch house, boots planted firm against the wood, rifle resting in his grip. She stood behind him, eyes sharp and unflinching, her frame slight, yet her presence unshaken. She did not cower. She did not cry out. Her resolve stood taller than any weapon they carried. The riders drew close, pulling their horses to a halt in a cloud of dust. Faces twisted with anger, voices rising sharp. They hurled accusations like stones. Betrayal, they called it. Treachery. Taking in the enemy, harboring blood that did not belong. The preacher's words from town came back to him, the muttered warnings, the threats cloaked as advice. All of it was here now, in the eyes of men who would rather see the world burned clean than allow love to take root where they thought it should not. The rancher said nothing at first, his silence a weight heavier than any words. In that stillness, he knew the choice before him. He could step aside, hand her over, and keep his name untarnished among his kind. He could save himself and his land and his reputation. Or he could stand with her, against them, against the tide of his own blood and history. The truth struck him not like a decision, but like a remembering, that somewhere along the way, she had ceased being a stranger. She had become the heartbeat he thought he had lost forever, the presence that brought him back from the hollow silence he once lived in. He turned only briefly, to see her face in the morning haze, and it was there he found his answer. He stepped down from a porch, rifle in hand, the fog curling around him. The men shouted, demanded, their words sharp as gunmetal. He lifted his weapon not to fire, but to remind them he was not a man to be broken. His voice cut through the chaos, steady, low, a voice that belonged to the land itself. He spoke not of betrayal, not of excuses, but of choice. His choice. His stand. The shouting swelled, the anger pressed closer. Torches wavered. Horses snorted restless. And then she moved. She came to his side, her posture straight, her gaze unflinching. She stood with him, shoulder to shoulder, no longer hidden behind his walls, but present before the world that despised her. Together, they became something more than man and woman. They became defiance itself, unity against the storm. The first shot cracked the air, shattering the fragile stillness. The rancher's arm jerked, blood streaking down his sleeve. Pain flared, but he held his ground until she pulled him to cover, her hands urgent, fierce. Her touch pressed against the wound, her strength steady even as bullets split the air. In that moment, their eyes met, and the truth neither had spoken flared bright and undeniable. Love, fierce and alive, burned there between them. He whispered through the pain, words that had waited too long in his chest. That he saw her, that he chose her, that whatever storm the world hurled at them, he would not turn away. Her eyes softened, tears bright but unshed, her hand gripping his as if to bind the vow. The attackers wavered. They had come expecting fear, surrender, weakness. Instead they found two figures standing unbroken, united not by law or blood, but by something deeper. Their anger faltered, their torches lowered, their resolve cracked. One by one, they pulled their horses back, muttering, spitting into the dust, retreating not because they were defeated in violence, but because they could not break what stood before them. Smoke curled in the dawn air, fading as the hoofbeats carried away. The ranch was scarred, fence posts splintered, dust torn, the ground littered with the remains of anger, but it still stood. And so did they. She sat with him in the quiet aftermath, her hand still holding his, not forbidden now, not uncertain. The world beyond might still call it wrong, but here, in the hush after the storm, it was the only truth that mattered. He leaned into her presence, weary but alive, and in her eyes he found not defiance alone, but tenderness at last. The fire of dawn burned brighter, lifting the fog, washing the land in gold once more. In that light, they were no longer strangers, no longer divided by blood or boundary. They were simply two souls who had chosen each other in a world that had tried to keep them apart. And if you were to listen close, as though the tale were whispered by the old wood of the house itself, you might hear this truth, that love is not found in perfection, nor in the safety of easy roads, but in the courage to see one another fully, to stand when standing costs everything. Sometimes the greatest gift is not the one we search for, but the one fate lays wounded at our doorstep, daring us to recognize it.